everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Jill, otherwise known as the Enlightened Target, and this channel is devoted to narcissistic abuse awareness and recovery, parental alienation, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and anything and everything associated with those three main topics. Today we're going to talk about complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. What is it? How is it different from regular PTSD? And how do you get it? Regular PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is something that can happen to a person after a specific traumatic event. It could be, a car accident, a robbery, a death, witnessing a violent crime. But it's usually triggered by an isolated specific event. Symptoms include flashbacks of the event, feelings of panic and distress, like you're actually living in that moment again. Hypervigilance is very common. Nightmares, insomnia, extreme anxiety, difficulty controlling anger. All of these are symptoms of PTSD. Complex PTSD, also sometimes referred to as developmental trauma, means that the victim has been subjected to repetitive trauma over a long period of time that typically, but not always, starts in childhood. It's a disorder that develops as a response to chronic traumatization over the course of months and usually years. This condition can affect people who have been exposed, to childhood abuse, obviously. Usually that's by a caregiver or someone they're dependent on. Long-term exposure to domestic violence, prisoners of war, someone living in captivity or living in crisis conditions or a war zone, human trafficking victims, concentration camp survivors. These are all people who are very likely to suffer from complex PTSD. So this is a disorder that is developed over a long period of time, continual traumatization. For those who go through this as children, like myself, because the brain is still developing and they're just, beginning to learn who they are as individuals, trying to understand the world that they live in, establishing and trying to build their very first relationships, this severe repetitive trauma they're exposed to interrupts the entire course of their psychological and neurological development. There's usually a very deep interpersonal relationship between the victim and their abuser. For children, like I said, it's usually the parent or a caregiver. Dr. Judith Herman wrote what, in my opinion, is the Bible on trauma. She wrote a book titled Trauma and Recovery, and she is the one who introduced this diagnosis of complex PTSD. And she explains that the perpetrator's goal is to establish dominance and break down the identity of the victim. The abuser establishes a totalitarian control over the victim. She explains that violence is only one of many coercive techniques that they use to accomplish this. So the victim is unable to escape the perpetrator. And this creates what she says is a contaminated identity. So the victim no longer has the will to resist. She further explains that this leads to a shamed and damaged sense of self, disrupted interpersonal relationships, and a shattered systems of meaning. What is a system of meaning? In these circumstances, it basically means that the victim's understanding of what love, comfort, and protection, what that looks like, and the meanings or definition of these are damaged or shattered, as she puts it. And there are also an added element of neglect, hot and cold affection from the perpetrator. The victim is usually dependent on the abuser for survival. So if this is a child in these circumstances, the child never has the opportunity to establish normal, healthy systems of meaning. So the child is dependent on an abusive parent or caretaker to provide them with what they need to survive, and that includes love, comfort, and safety. So the child's systems of meaning most times will equate love with abuse and protection and comfort with control. Also, because of the hot and cold affection that the abuser exposes the victim to, the victim will usually develop what's called a trauma bond to their abuser, which in its simplest form means there is a loyalty the victim has to the abuser. A trauma bond is formed in the relationship where there's inconsistent reinforcement. So the abuser will be kind and nice at times and abusive and cruel at times. And this inconsistent reinforcement that is what develops this, the victim develops this unhealthy attachment or bond to their abuser. And trauma bonding is a very important topic that I'll go into detail about in another video, because it's extremely important, because it's at the heart of why so many victims of narcissistic abuse can't seem to leave or can't seem to stay no contact. But based on the patterns of abuse that victims of narcissistic abuse experience, and certainly if you are raised in a narcissistically abusive environment, you can see how this disorder clearly would develop in someone living in these conditions. So let's talk about some of the symptoms of complex PTSD. Difficulty regulating emotions. Many victims suffer from what's called emotional flashbacks, which means that they have these overwhelming, intense reactions and feelings that you originally felt during the trauma, such as extreme fear, deep shame and sorrow, sadness. Many times you'll feel severe depression. Thoughts of suicide are also common. Most people with CPTSD will have difficulty controlling their anger. Many times an emotional flashback can be triggered and you will not know what triggered it. You won't know why. Just this overwhelming sadness, fear, sorrow will come over you. These flashbacks can last hours, weeks, or even months. Sometimes you may be able to identify what triggered an emotional flashback, but many times you will not know. However, I will say, once you become aware of what an emotional flashback is, and that this is what you've been experiencing for all these years, it is beyond relief. Finally, there is a name to these horrible spells, or spirals is what I used to call them. And you can start to, once you have a name for it, you can start to identify what the triggers are, as well as, and more importantly, you will begin to learn how to self-soothe yourself through one. You'll start to learn how to emotionally regulate yourself and talk yourself through them. And usually, over time, they'll start to lessen in frequency and lessen in intensity, which, for people who suffer from these, it is huge. When I first learned exactly what an emotional flashback was, after suffering from these, oh my gosh, ever since I can remember, the relief and happiness I felt just to finally simply know what this was life-changing for me. Another symptom is deep feelings of shame or guilt. Victims develop what is called toxic shame, which means the person doesn't feel they have necessarily done something they feel they should be ashamed about. They feel that the core of who they are as a human being is shameful. So most victims also struggle with feelings of self-blame. Dissociation is also another very common symptom for people with CPTSD. Dissociation, in the simplest terms, means feeling detached from your body, actions, or surroundings. Some people say it feels like they're watching themselves in a movie. Other people I've heard say it seems like they're not real. Some people like me call it spacing out. Ever since I can remember, I've had these space outs where I'd be in a conversation with someone, and suddenly all of a sudden I'm just not there. I'm like absorbed into this weird space all of my own. And usually someone would have to get my attention to kind of bring me back to what's going on around me. It's a feeling of disconnection, and it's actually the mind's way of coping with the trauma. It's the mind's way of actually protecting itself, so you detach or you disconnect, so you don't have to experience or feel these emotions. For me personally, I used to struggle with ruminating thoughts, which also, by the way, is another symptom of CPTSD. Ruminating thoughts are, thinking of it over and over and over. I used to really, really struggle with this. And I would often experience a dissociation when I would begin to ruminate about everything. So all of a sudden, I would just be in this spaced out state, not focused on anything around me, just kind of, out of it for a few moments. And then something would bring me back into reality, a noise or something would, make me kind of come back around, and I would realize I had just disassociated. So if you were, if you've been subjected to repetitive abuse over years, especially in childhood, this will usually be a lifelong symptom you've experienced. Another symptom is changes in self-perception. The person feels inherently different than other people, and not in a good way. They view themselves in a negative light. They develop a very negative self-image. They feel as though there's something like fundamentally different or wrong with them. It's also common to have very intense feelings of helplessness and aloneness. Another symptom is preoccupation with the abuser, and this is one that's difficult for some people to understand. However, it's very, very common for people with CPTSD to become fixated on their abuser. This can include becoming obsessed with the abuser or dissecting the relationship with the abuser. Victims may come to accept and even believe the abuser is right, or rationalize the abuse they're being subjected to. Or this can manifest as an obsession for revenge. Many times parents who have been severely alienated from their children will have fantasies about revenge for a time period. Another symptom is difficulty with personal relationships. People with CPTSD many times develop unhealthy relationships because they find it very difficult to interact and trust others. Many times they will also, they tend to alienate themselves and isolate themselves from others. Another symptom is changes in beliefs. People who suffer from repetitive trauma may lose faith in God or in humanity, maybe in themselves, but where they once had faith or trust in the world, they will lose that, and they usually develop an overwhelming sense of hopelessness and despair. CPTSD is not in the DSM yet as PTSD is. However, I have heard from many professionals that they think it will be included and officially become a diagnosis when the next DSM comes out. So because of this, many times CPTSD can be misdiagnosed as something else or a personality disorder. An uneducated mental health care professional who does not know what CPTSD is or how to identify the symptoms will most likely diagnose it with a personality disorder, most likely borderline personality disorder. Also, please do not ever take it for granted or assume that a mental health care professional will know about narcissistic abuse or CPTSD. I have learned this the hard way. I took a lot of them at their word that they were educated and experienced about all of this, and when the reality was they had no clue what narcissistic abuse was and didn't have a clue even what the definition of CPTSD was. So for people like us, we have to have proof. If we're reaching out for someone for help, we need proof that they actually know what this is, because many times they will tell you they do when they don't. I would want to review someone's CV before I started therapy just to make absolutely certain that they are knowledgeable. Otherwise, the damage they can cause it can be really bad. Trust me on this one. So if you have suffered from long-term narcissistic abuse, and certainly if you have been severely alienated from your children or gone through years of legal abuse, you most likely are going to be suffering from CPTSD. If you're struggling with any of these symptoms, I encourage you to read Pete Walker's book. He wrote a book called Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, or reach out to an experienced therapist or coach to work with, because that can honestly make all the difference in the world. But healing starts with naming it, and then you can start sorting through it all and really start that healing journey. I will say that in my opinion, true healing and recovery from CPTSD cannot and will not happen living in that abusive environment or with any consistent exposure to your abuser. For me personally, my healing could not have happened living in the conditions I was being subjected to. So if these symptoms sound familiar to you, I hope that you will reach out for help and support and learn all that you can about complex trauma. The last point I want to make is that narcissistic abuse and CPTSD go hand in hand. If you have been subjected to narcissistic abuse over a long period of time, chances will be that you're suffering to this to some degree. And the longer you're exposed to the abuse, the worse this condition and will become. So symptoms will intensify and become worse over time. So getting away and going no contact should be a very, very high priority. All right, that's going to do it for this video. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. And subscribe to my channel. If you know somebody who might benefit from watching this video, please send it to them or share it. Also, if you have any questions or want to share an experience or comments, please leave those in the comments below. I'd love to read them. I'm going to be trying to put out at least one video a week, so stay tuned, and I appreciate y'all watching. Bye-bye.